أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. How are you all? How are you Mu'tasim? How are you Sharat? Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, good. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. So what we are going to do today, inshallah, this is our 5th class, and we'll start from where we left. We started to discuss the details of the attribute sampling, and we said that there are 4 activities or 4 steps rather in the attribute sampling. And if you remember, the first step was to plan, the second step was to perform, the third step was to evaluate, and the fourth step was to document. Right? We discussed that there are 4 steps. We start to talk about the first step, which is to plan the audit procedure using the attribute sampling method. And there are tasks inside that first step of planning, and we discussed those. Now, before we go into the second step, which is performing the audit procedure, we have a sample size that we are going to use to select our sample items. And we discussed what we are going to summarize in this slide. We discussed it in detail in our previous session. So if you have any difficulty in understanding the summarized discussion, you can go back to the previous class's lecture and listen to it again, watch the video again. What we have here is the desired confidence level, the first factor that affects the sample size. If we want a higher confidence level, if we want to be more confident that our sample is representative of the population, then we need to increase the sample size. So the higher the desired confidence level is, the higher the sample size is going to be. There is a direct relationship, and the opposite is also true. The lower the confidence level is, the smaller the sample size is going to be. The second factor is the tolerable deviation rate. So if we have a higher tolerance, if we can tolerate more errors, then we can have a smaller sample size. And if we cannot tolerate a lot of errors, if our tolerable deviation rate is less, if it is low, then we need to increase the sample size. So this is an inverse relationship. And why exactly is that? We discussed in our previous lecture. And the third one is expected population deviation rate. If we have a high expected population deviation rate, then we would increase the sample size. And we discussed this with an example in our previous class. You can go back and listen to that. If we have lower expectation from the population about the deviation, then we can decrease the sample size. Okay, so these are the 3 factors that are either directly or inversely, right? One is going up, the other one is going down. That's the inverse relationship. And direct is when one increases, the other one increases. So desired confidence level and expected population deviation rate, both when they go up, the sample size increases, and when they go down, the sample size decreases. On the other hand, the tolerable deviation rate, when it increases, we have a higher tolerance, you can have a lower sample size. And we have a lower tolerance, you need to increase the sample size. So these three are related. There is a fourth factor here, which is population size. What is the actual size of the population? There is not a fixed relationship with the population size, uh, where the population size is not directly related to the sample size, except if the population size is really small. Let's say you have less than 500 or fewer uh, items, then you can perhaps lower the sample size. Otherwise, the other factors that you see, the first three factors, would determine the sample size. Okay? I'm going to continue and not ask you every time if it's clear or not. If you have a question, please let me know, and I will address it, inshallah. Now we come to the second activity. So there's a question here. By why it is so? Because when the population is too big, we would need a bigger sample size, right? No, we don't need a bigger sample size based on the population size. Remember, the whole idea of doing statistical sampling is so that you can have a small yet representative sample. So the procedure we are following, the way we are going to select the samples, and we're going to discuss exactly how, is going to allow us to select an efficient sample size, which we discussed, remember, right? So we want an efficient sample size, and we want to make sure that what we selected is sufficient based on our audit procedure, right? Are you following? Because we have large populations, and if we continue to increase the sample size, we don't have time, remember. What we sell, Sharat, as auditors is our time. So we bill our clients based on time, okay? We bill our clients based on time. So, uh, for example, when I left the firm, my every single hour of my time spent for a client was, if I remember correctly, $150, right? For every single hour. So if the client got an hour of my attention, hour of my time, the firm billed the client $150. So remember, our time is very expensive. As an auditor, if you're an excellent auditor, if you go up in the chain, if you become a senior auditor, then um, your time is very expensive, and the more expensive your time is, the more valuable you are, and the higher your pay is going to be. So you cannot spend your time looking for errors in large samples. Okay, is that clear, Sharat? You follow? Okay. Now we now have to uh, do two things here in the step that we call performing the actual audit procedure. So the first one is selecting the sample items, and the second one is performing the audit procedure. Now remember, everything that we do until we perform the audit procedure is to perform the audit procedure. We don't do the sample size calculation, and we don't do the sample selection and the statistics and so forth just because we love statistics or just because we love to calculate numbers. We do all that to come to the audit procedure, which is our actual task, right? The audit procedure is what we are after. So now we are going to get down to the actual audit procedure, and before that we need the actual items from our population to perform the audit procedure. So let's start. The first is selecting the sample items. Now let's say we calculate the sample size, and let's say our sample size is 50, for example. So our sample size is 50, and we're going to take 50 items from our sample. We have the first method, which is random selection. That is, every single item has the same probability of getting selected in our sample. What we do here is we ask the statistics software, for example, Excel or any other software, to give us 50 random numbers. So let's say we have a population of checks. The check numbers are from 1001 to 2000. So 1001, 1002, 1003, 1025, 1150, like this. We have 1000 checks that we're going to select 50 checks from. We ask the software to give us 50 numbers. So the software generates 50 random numbers, and we go to that box and we select 50 checks, okay, based on the numbers the software generates. So that's the random selection. The second method is systematic selection. Systematic selection is we generate a first random number, right? And we add an nth number with that first number, which we call that a sampling interval, which is calculated by dividing the population with the sample size. Now, let's say your population is 1000 and your sample size is 50, right? So your uh, your sampling interval is going to be 20. So your population is 1000 and your sample size is 50. This 20 is called a sampling interval. So you will select every 20th number after you select the first item. So let's say the first item you selected was check number 1025. The next would be check number 1045. The next one would be check number 1065. The next one would be check number 1085. Are you following? Right? So we have the nth number, right? This is called systematic selection. This is called systematic selection. So we have two different methods of actually selecting the items that we're going to audit. Now, once we have selected the items, we have these 50 checks. Let's say we have selected 50 checks. We will perform the audit procedure. The actual audit procedure is taking one check at a time, right? Now, there is a terminology we mentioned in our previous class. Each item, right, in auditing terminology is called what? Each item we take and we do the audit procedure, we call that what? Sampling unit. Excellent, very good. Sampling unit. So our sampling unit in this case is one check, right? The audit procedure is now all the circles that we have done until now is to do this audit procedure. What is the audit procedure? Take each sampling unit, each check, and examine. Examine what? What are we looking for in each check? What are we looking for? If there are two signatures or not. Excellent, very good. So two signatures or not. Now, if we have two signatures, that means they follow the control. If they don't have two signatures, we call it a deviation. Outstanding, very good. So we call that a deviation. Now, there are some other details when you're performing the audit procedure that you should keep in mind, because these situations would come up. That is, the first here is replace voided documents, meaning let's say you take a check and this is a check that they started to use and they made a mistake and they did not complete They voided that document. It's not actually written, it's voided, it's not used, right? It's voided. They made a mistake and they voided that check that is in your sample. So if you find a check like that in your sample, obviously you cannot verify whether there are two signatures or not. You would then put it back and you would take another one. Okay? You would replace that with a check where they used the check and you can see whether there are two signatures or not. The second type is if you take a blank check. Let's say you take a check, sometimes they can turn 2 pages of the checkbook at the same time, missing a check. You know how it happens to us when we are using a notebook. It can happen when they're using a checkbook, and that blank check is in your sample. So you put that blank check back and you take another one. The third type of document is if you take something in your sample which is not a check. Maybe this is a receipt, maybe this is some other document that is included in your sample of 50 that you selected. In that case, you put that back and you take another one, right? So these three: voided, unused, and inapplicable. All right? The third is if you have a check that you cannot read properly. Either the handwriting is not clear, you don't understand whether this is a check that is 10,000 or 1,000 or 8,000. You're not sure what exactly is written, or you cannot understand whether the signature they have, it's one signature or two signatures. It's not clear. The audit procedure says, the official audit procedure says, if you have a document like that that is not clearly written and you cannot read, you consider that a deviation. You consider that a deviation. Remember, this is the official audit procedure. But I will tell you something outside the official audit procedure, what happens in real life. I used to go at least once a year to the client's office and work with clients' documents. This was not an audit procedure, but it was a tax engagement, but we looked at the documents the same way the auditors would do. And what do you think I would do if I picked up a document and it's not written clearly and I'm in the client's office? What would I do? What do you think I would do if I cannot read it? I asked the client, right? As the client, as the accountant of the client, or as the management of the client, what is written? Very good. This is the real life procedure. Although for your purposes, you should know the audit procedure. What is the audit procedure, right? And if you follow the audit procedure, no one can blame you. But because the client is right there and we want to make the life easy for the client, we would ask. The fourth item under this, performing the audit procedure, is stop the test if a large number of deviations are detected early on. Now, let's say you have 50 in your sample size, and in the first 10, you find 5 deviations, right? You find 5 deviations, 50% deviations, and your tolerable is only 2 or 3 out of 50. In that case, there is no need to perform the rest of the audit procedure. You can conclude that the control is not effective. The control is not followed, right? The control is not effective. They do not follow the control procedures. If you find too many deviations in the first few, then you can stop the procedure and you can conclude. All right? Any questions on this? Clear? All right. Now let's do the same with some numbers. Here we have the confidence level set at 95%, tolerable rate set at 6%, and expected rate set at 1%. Now, these numbers are based on the auditor's experience with the industry, with the client, knowledge of the financial statements from the previous year, etc., etc. When you go as an auditor, when you start working as an auditor, if you do, then this is not something that you will be asked to do in your first engagement or your first year or two. You will learn how they come up with the confidence level, how they calculate or determine the tolerable rate, the expected rate. This is based on their judgment and their experience. And you're going to learn this client by client, engagement by engagement. But for our purposes, these three are given to us. Okay, these three are given to us. And when you come in as a junior auditor, it will be given to you. So what you have to do is, based on this, using the table provided to you, you have to calculate the sample size. So now here we have the sample size at 95% desired confidence level. You have 1% expected population deviation rate and 6% tolerable deviation rate. So your sample size is 78 based on the information given to you. Based on the information given to you, your sample size is 78. Okay? Now, let me ask you if you can remember, based on the numbers that you see, what is the precision? What is the precision? 5. How do we get that? Very good. How do we calculate that? What is the formula for calculating the basic precision? The precision? Tolerable rate minus expected rate. Very good. So that's the basic precision. Very good. Now you take those 78 items. You take the 78 items and you take one check at a time and you perform the audit procedures, one check at a time. What is the audit procedure when you take a check? The audit procedure is what? Check if there are two signatures or not. Very good. Now, because in a classroom setting, I cannot give each one of you 78 checks, and you go through 78 checks and see how many deviations you have. We have to come up with the deviation without performing the actual procedure. But let's say we did go through 78 checks and we found two deviations, right? Now, in the audit simulation that we have at the end of the semester or near the end of the semester, inshallah, you will actually go through some documents and you will actually find some errors and document them and make a conclusion. Because of the online environment, I cannot give you the full simulation that we have been using since 2016. And alhamdulillah, the simulation, the big simulation, was published last year in the Journal of Accounting Education, and it's now available globally. It's available to all universities, and we developed it at Qatar University, and our students, your elder brother, have completed that, and it is now available globally. And just 2 days ago, I received an email from one of the professors at a university in the U.S., the University of Toledo. She was going to use this, and she asked me for the solution and so forth. The solution obviously is not available publicly, so that is something she asked me for, and I provided that. So as you can see, this is, alhamdulillah, instead of we adopting other people's exercises and solutions, we have our own, and the others are adopting it, alhamdulillah. And because that is so big, that audit simulation is so big that it cannot be given online, it has to be in a face-to-face environment. We developed another one last spring of 2020, which can be provided. The audit simulation will allow you to actually perform the audit procedure and find the deviations, right? But for now, we will go through the calculations as if we did the performance of the audit procedure and we found the deviations. Okay, so we have two deviations here. Now, 2 out of 78, what is the deviation rate? What is the actual deviation rate? 2 out of 78, what percentage is the deviation? Can you do the calculation? 2.6. Excellent. 2 divided by 78, 2.6%. Is that more or less than the tolerable? It is less. If it is less, if your finding is that your tolerance is more and your actual deviation is less, then you have to do one more step. That step is calculating something called the upper deviation rate. Upper deviation rate is calculated based on this table, and you have the sample size on one side, that is 78, which is very close to 80, and the actual deviations found is 2, right? And this is 7.7, which is the upper deviation rate. So why is it 2 divided by 78, right? 2 deviations found out of 78, that's why, right? If you find 2 deviations out of 78, then what is the percentage? And this is basic mathematics. You calculate and you find the percentage is, your percentage of deviation is 2.6. Is that clear? Now, 2.6 is less than 6%, which we said is tolerable. If we have a situation like this, then we go to the next step. Audit procedure says you have to calculate upper deviation. Upper deviation is calculated based on this table. You have the deviations, actual deviations, which is 2. Sample size is 78, which is close to 80. So now you have 7.7%. That is the upper deviation rate. So far, so good. You take this upper deviation rate and you compare that with the tolerable rate. And if the upper deviation rate is larger, if it's higher than the tolerable rate, then you conclude that the control is not reliable. Okay? If the upper deviation rate based on your calculation is higher than the tolerable, then your control is not reliable. The control is not effective, meaning they have too many deviations. Okay? This is what the statistical formula is telling you, right? Now, let's just come outside the statistics. Forget all the formulas and so forth. If you took 78 checks and you only found 2 of them missing 2 signatures and 76 of them had 2 signatures, how do you feel about this? Do you feel it's okay? Forget the statistics, just as a reasonable individual, what do you think? Is that okay? You would think it's good, right? I would also think that it's okay. Now, the statistical formulas are there as a tool and as a guide. But as an auditor, you have the flexibility to make a judgment even if certain numbers indicate certain results. You can, based on your experience, based on your understanding, based on your knowledge, you can make certain judgments. But if you make a conclusion, whatever the conclusion is, either you rely on the formula or you don't rely on the formula, or whatever it is that you do, you must document. You must document. Once the procedure is complete, what is your conclusion? Is it reliable? If yes, why? What you calculated and what your judgment is and why you conclude it is reliable. Is it not reliable? Then write down why you say it is not reliable. This documentation is very important, and while something may be very obvious to you when you have concluded the procedure, it is highly recommended and it is very useful to write down every single detail that you can think of for the conclusion and why you conclude. It would happen sometimes when I was working as an accountant, as a CPA, that I would pick up a client file. And every time I picked up a client file, if it was an existing client, I would look at the previous year's work papers. I would look at the previous year's work papers, the uh, work that was done by the previous accountant, previous year's work, and I try to understand what happened last year. Sometimes I'd pick up a file and I would see that the accountant has done something and I would be shocked. I would say that how could this accountant do this? Who is this accountant? And I would go to the back of the document, I'll find my signature. It was me who worked on that client. So I would be very worried. But then I would go to the documentation and I would read my notes. I would read exactly what I wrote there and what I highlighted and why I concluded and so forth in this particular way, and it would make sense to me. So just think about it. My own document, I don't remember 1 year later because I worked on many clients. I don't remember the specific details, but the documentation, the details that I wrote helped me. Just think about if it was another accountant, it would be more so, right? Because I forgot my own. So if it is another accountant, right, the accountant would know clearly, and you cannot write too many details. You know, the more details you write, the better it is. Are you following? So I'm saying all this, I'm giving you all these stories and so forth, so that you know the importance of documentation and how it will help you. Is that clear? Right? Are you following? Okay, very good. So documentation of why your conclusion is the way it is. Very good. So this brings us to the end of the procedure. Now we are going to look at the non-statistical attribute sampling method. So the process that we followed until now, the procedures that we followed until now, until we concluded and documented, is using the statistical attribute sampling. The other option is to do non-statistical attribute sampling, and everything is going to be the same as the statistical attribute sampling method, except two things will be different. The first one is how you determine the sample size, and the second one is how you select the sample items. Remember, the sample size selection in the statistical method, the 78 we selected is based on confidence level, tolerable deviation rate, expected deviation rate. But here it will be different, right? How so? Let's take a look. We have here a simple method. We don't go into all those individual numbers, but we ask ourselves, how important is this control procedure? How important is this control procedure? What is the control procedure? The control procedure is that the client requires two signatures on every single check that is 10,000 or larger. Why? Because they want to minimize fraud. We, as the independent external auditors, ask the question, how important is this control? How much do we care for this control? How much we want to rely on this control? And if this control is very important to us, then we select a sample size that is higher. And these numbers, as you see here, these are numbers that are based on auditor's judgment, and these will vary from client to client, from engagement to engagement. This is just an example. For our purposes, if you have to use these numbers, it will be given to you. For our purposes, it will be given to you. All right? For our purposes, these numbers will be given to you. So if we want to rely on the control, if we, the independent external auditors, say that this control is very important to us and we want to rely on this control, we would have a higher range. If it is not that important, we will go down in the sample size. And these numbers are given to all the auditors who are using the same method, so that this policy is consistent throughout the audit. So all the auditors know that how important a particular control is, and based on that importance or lack of importance, we're going to select a sample size in this range, right? 15 to 20, 25 to 35, or 40 to 60, based on how important we think the control procedure is. Is that clear? We don't go into the tolerable or expected or confidence level or anything like that. We just make a simple selection, simple calculation. All right? Very good. Once we determine that, okay, it's a very important control, we want to rely on this control, and our sample size is 50, let's say. We then go and select the actual sample items. And as you see, the first two are exactly the same. So these are three options. You can select, you can go for any one of these three options when you're using non-statistical attribute sampling. The first one is random. As you remember, in our previous one we discussed a few minutes back, you ask the software to generate random numbers, 50 random numbers in a range. Your check numbers are between 1001 and 2000. So the system generates 50 random numbers, 1025, 1107, 1275, like that, 50 numbers. In this case, every single check has the same possibility of getting selected. The second one is systematic. Remember, we calculate a sampling interval, which is calculated by dividing the sample size with the population size, right? This is called sampling interval. Sampling interval, and I'm sorry, this is the opposite. I made a mistake. Population size divided by sample size. Okay, population size divided by sample size. That's the correct one. Forget this first. I made a mistake there. So population size divided by sample size, and that's called sampling interval. And we select the first item randomly. So the software gives you a first random number, and you add the sampling interval after that. So this, the first random number is 1050, and the interval is 20. So the next check is going to be 1070. The following check is going to be 1090. So you add 20 and you select the next item. This is called a systematic sample selection. And the third one is haphazard. Haphazard is there is no reasoning. You just go and you select the samples without any reasoning. Just go there and you just start, go in front of that box where all the checks are, and you just start picking up the ones you like. Haphazard, right? You could send anyone, you could send a non-auditor, just, who has no knowledge, just pick any 50. This is haphazard, no system. All right, is that clear? So other than these two things, the procedure is the same. Is that clear? The random is generated, the random numbers are generated based on a calculation performed by the software, right? So the random number, when you're generating random numbers, every single number has the same possibility of getting selected. The haphazard is not generated using any random number generation. It's just haphazard without any method. Okay, all right. Any questions so far on what we have studied? Okay. So if we do not have any questions, we'll stop here, inshallah, and I will see you, inshallah, on Thursday. Okay? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.